turn to 1 Samuel chapter 1. Read verses 1 and 2 and verse 20. 1 Samuel 1, verses 1 and 2 and verse 20. Now there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of Mount Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jehoram, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraite. He had two wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Verse 20, wherefore it came to pass, when the time was come, about after Hannah had conceived, that she bare a son, called his name Samuel, saying, because I have asked him of the Lord. 1 Samuel 1 begins the account of the life of Samuel, who of course was Israel's first major prophet. But the focus in this account is upon his mother, Hannah. The chapter opens by introducing us to Samuel's family. In verse 1, there's mention made of his father, Elkanah, also of his grandfather, Jehoram, and of his great-grandfather, Elihu, and his great-great-grandfather, Tohu, and his great-great-great-grandfather, Zuph. And then we're told something of the family dynamic. In verse 2, Samuel's father had two wives. Their names were Hannah and Peninnah. Concerning these two, Peninnah had children. Hannah had no children. Hannah had no children. And that really sets the stage for what is before us. We read in verse 5 that Elkanah loved Hannah, but that the Lord had shut up her womb. And we're told something of the family's practice of going to the house of the Lord. And we're told something of the problematic relationship between Hannah and Peninnah, and the trials of Hannah due to the fact that she was childless and that she had an adversarial relationship with Peninnah. But then we come to verse 20. And Hannah gives birth to a son, whom she named Samuel. The reason she named him Samuel is because of the meaning of his name, because I have asked him of the Lord. Then Hannah nursed Samuel 2 to 3 years, and then went to the house of the Lord, where she surrendered him to the Lord's service. That's where Samuel would grow up. Hannah was a godly woman, godly mother. And as such, she, of course, is an example to women and mothers. But not only that, she is an example to all. She's an example to women. She's an example to men. She's an example to all children of God. Our subject this morning this afternoon is Samuel's mother, a godly example. By way of background, the time frame would be that of the judges. So we know that it was a bad time. It was a sinful time. It was a time when there was a lack of revelation from God. In fact, we read in 1 Samuel 3, verse 1, there was no open vision. That is, no open prophecies. People were sinful, and God was silent during this time frame. It was a time of lack of restraint. We read in Judges 21:25 that there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. No prophet, no preaching, situational ethics, do your own thing. If it feels good, do it. It was a time when there was a lack of respect for the Lord. We read in 1 Samuel 2:17, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. So the setting of what is before us is one of spiritual decline, spiritual degeneracy, national departure from God, rebellion, waywardness, permissiveness, idolatry was everywhere. It was a time of miserable spiritual failure, time of great turmoil, time of confusion. And the whole situation in the nation of Israel was very bleak, to say the least. They were in they were a culture in crisis. That pretty much describes the time period of the Judges, a very tragic hour in the history of Israel. In addition to that, we see that there were some family problems in this family. In verse 1, again, we're introduced to Elkanah. We're told that he had 2 wives. Though Elkanah was justified by the customs of the day, he was in violation of God's institution and law of marriage, and therefore not justified. God's pattern, still today, is one man, one woman, till death do us part. That's God's pattern. From verse 2, we see that one of his wives was Hannah and the other Peninnah. And there were the children of Peninnah. But again we read, but Hannah had no children. So Peninnah had children. And then that next word, but, shows a contrast, but it also indicative of a problem. But Hannah had no children. And we read in verse 5 that Elkanah loved Hannah, but the Lord shut up her womb. And the fact that the Lord had shut up her womb is repeated again in verse 6. Peninnah was jealous of Hannah, perhaps because of Elkanah's love for her. And from verse 6 we see that she became her adversary. We read there in verse 6 that she provoked her sore for to make her fret, because, or the reason, was the Lord had shut up her womb. So she was provoked. That is, speaks of irritation, insulted, annoyed. It says she provoked her sore. That is, very severely, in a hurtful way. Her intention was to make her fret, to make her miserable. So within that household, there is Peninnah who sets out to make Hannah's life one of misery. We read in verse 7 that she provoked her, therefore she wept and did not eat. She was taunted continually by Peninnah. For Hannah, provocation, cruelty, ridicule were part of her everyday life. We read in verse 10 that she was in bitterness of soul. She was in an irreconcilable state. There was no one who could really comfort her. So Peninnah was successful in making her miserable. Hannah's heaviest burden was that she was childless. Verse 2, Hannah had no children. Verse 5, the Lord had shut up her womb. Repeated again in verse 6. This was a very heavy, emotional trial. Now, in those days, childlessness was a terrible stigma. And it was seen as a curse. And it was seen as, by women who couldn't have children, as a great affliction. In fact, we read in verse 11, Hannah refers to her condition as an affliction. And Jacob's wife, Leah, when she was expecting, said in Genesis 29:32, the Lord has looked upon my affliction. So it was considered an affliction. It was like a disease. And Rachel, because she could not have children, but her sister could, she said in Genesis 30, verse 1, give me children or else I die. So it was a very heavy affliction, a great burden. And Hannah had no children. A very heavy burden for Hannah. Now, again, infertility in the Old Testament was viewed as a shame and disgrace. It was looked upon as a sign of failure. And in addition to this, there were the family dynamics, taunted by Peninnah for being barren, verse 6. So she's a woman with heavy afflictions. But in spite of all of that, she is a godly example. She is an inspiration, not only to women, but to all. So we want to look at some of the characteristics of Hannah, and each one of these could be a message in itself. But as you look at Hannah, you see a profile of a godly woman. You see a profile of a godly person, what we all ought to be as children of God. Hannah was a woman of grace. Her name means favor or grace. On the other hand, the name Peninnah means pearl or beauty, which may explain why Elkanah married Peninnah. May explain it. But Hannah, she was loved by Elkanah. Doesn't say that Peninnah was. Hannah, God's favor. The meaning of the name, and again, the meaning of names were very significant in those times. And it would serve as a reminder to Hannah that she was an object of God's favor. And that wasn't because of anything in her. Her name would serve as a reminder of where her help came from. Her name would remind her what she needed was not more skill. What she needed was God's help. Her name would remind her that she what she needed was God's intervention in her life. And I believe that was very real to Hannah. Her circumstances, again in verse 2, but Hannah had no children. And though barren, ridiculed, and tormented, she's an object of God's favor. In other words, she's blessed. And this would override her adverse times and circumstances. Her name reminds her that God sees you in favor. You may have no children. Peninnah can't stand you, but God sees you in favor. Her name would remind her that her problems cannot overwhelm God's favor. And I believe Hannah was a testimony of God's grace. Overall, she displayed God's grace in her life. She was a picture of the grace of God, which is what we all ought to be. So in Hannah, the grace of God was clear. It was definite. It made a difference in her life. And that difference could be seen in the life that she lived. In verse 13 and 14, when Eli the priest saw her lips silently moving and tears streaming down her face, he immediately assumed that she was drunk. And he began to rebuke her. And Hannah's response, verse 15 and 16, was, "No, my Lord, count not thine handmaid for a daughter of Belial." Hannah means grace, and it grieved her heart to be thought of anything less than God's grace. So Hannah is saying there, don't think of me that way. I respect the holiness of God. She's an example to all of us. We also see that Hannah was a woman of prayer. Greatly afflicted, greatly burdened, living in a terribly difficult time, living in a terribly difficult situation. She's in much distress and anguish of soul. She had disappointment, frustration, and grief and sorrow in her life. She's burdened. She's weighted down. We're told in verse 7 that Elkanah and his wives went up to the house of the Lord. And while Peninnah ate of the sacrificial portions that Elkanah gave her, Hannah refused to eat. In verse 8, Elkanah, her husband, attempts to comfort her in a very feeble and really ignorant way, but he did not understand her burden. And in verse 9, Hannah rose up. And in verse 10, we read that though in bitterness of soul, she prayed unto the Lord. She prayed unto the Lord. She prayed for help. She prayed for strength. She no doubt could feel her own helplessness, and no doubt she could feel His omnipotence. She was praying. She is praying with a desire for the blessings that only God could give. She's not just going through the motions of prayer, the mechanics of prayer. This was no ordinary prayer. Verse 10, and she was in bitterness of soul and prayed unto the Lord and wept sore, or in a painful way. She prays weeping. She prays feeling pain. In verse 11, she specifically prays for a son. So she's single-minded in her prayer. And in verse 12 we read, she continued praying. She prayed with persistence. And in verse 13 we read, she spake in her heart. So it is a heartfelt prayer. She prayed earnestly. She prayed fervently. Her prayer was marked by passion. There was an intensity. There was a vigor. There was an energy. There was a diligence and a determination and a desire. There was a yearning of heart and soul. In verse 16, she was praying out of abundance of what she was feeling within. Count not thine handmaid for a daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken hitherto. She's praying again. She's filled with distress, and she empties that distress unto the Lord. She's praying, she's filled with anguish, and she empties that anguish unto the Lord. She's filled with hurt, and she empties that hurt unto the Lord. She's filled with sorrow, and she empties that unto the Lord. She's filled with burdens, and she empties her burdens unto the Lord. She's filled with disappointments, and she empties her disappointments unto the Lord. She's filled with desires. She wants a child. She wants a son. And she empties her desires unto the Lord. What she's doing in her prayer is she's laying everything out before God. And all for such a praying spirit today. And she serves as an example. Hannah also was a woman of faith. That's obvious from the fact that she prayed the way she prayed. Hannah had no children. She's suffering from what she did not have. But at the same time, she's laying hold on what she did have. And that, of course, being the Lord. Notice in verse 11 that when she addresses the Lord, she addresses Him as the Lord of hosts. In other words, she believed that He was in control of all. Why would you pray to someone who isn't in control? So she prayed, and she believed that He could give her her request. She believed that God was able. She believed that God could do the impossible. We need to be a people of faith, confident in God. Confident in God. That was Hannah. Hannah was also a woman who acknowledged the goodness of God. Verse 20, Hannah conceived and bare a son, and all the joy that filled her heart. And we read that she called his name Samuel, meaning God is heard. God is heard. So by naming him Samuel, she was acknowledging that it was God. That it was God. In verse 27, she declared to Eli, for this child I prayed. For this child I prayed. Thank God for the mom that prayed for you before you were born, if that was the case. Hannah also was a woman of love and commitment. And what we read here is just beyond belief almost. In Hannah's prayer for a son, verse 11, she vowed a vow, saying, I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life. So she's praying for a son, and she wants this son so that she can give him unto the Lord. After her request for a son was granted by God, she did not forget her commitment that she had made unto the Lord. Many people make commitments unto God while they're praying. But then when God answers, God grants the request, they forget the commitment. They feel that by making a commitment, they're adding some kind of power to their prayer. But Hannah didn't forget her commitment. In verse 21, Elkanah and his house went up to offer unto the Lord the yearly sacrifice. And in verse 22, Hannah went not up, for she said unto her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned. In the Old Testament, that was a period of 2 to 3 years. But notice, I will bring him that he may appear before the Lord, and there, in the house of God, abide forever. So she had made a commitment that if God would give her a son, she would hand him over to the priest to be raised in the house of the Lord. She would not even raise her own son. That's quite a commitment. Not an easy thing. And then in verse 24, and when she had weaned him, again a period of 2 to 3 years, she took him up with her. Through those 2 to 3 years of weaning, she did not backtrack on her commitment to God. During those 2 to 3 years of weaning, the love grew that she had for Samuel. But she didn't backtrack on her commitment to God of handing him over. She didn't talk her way out of it. You give most people 2 to 3 years to think about their commitment, they'll talk themselves out of it. You give them 2 to 3 minutes, and they'll talk themselves out of it. 2 to 3 years. She's still committed. Through those 2 to 3 years of weaning, many things would have happened. And her love and attachment for Samuel grew. And she remained steadfast in her commitment to God. What an example. What an example for people to remain steadfast in their commitment to God. And then after 2 to 3 years of weaning, without any attempt to avoid the commitment that she had made, she takes her journey to the house of God. And on that journey, she remained steadfast in her commitment to God. Oh, it would have been easy. As you're on your way to the house of God to hand over your son, it would have been pretty easy to talk your way out of the commitment. But she didn't. She had a vital and personal relationship with God. And nothing could remove her from her commitment. People make commitments all the time. Usually they mean nothing. They mean nothing, whether they be commitments to the Lord or whatever. Usually they don't mean anything. But Hannah remained steadfast in her commitment. She did not forget the commitment she made. Probably everyone here that is saved has made commitments to God. The question is, how steadfast are we in our commitment? What does it take for us to lay aside our commitment? Not much, in most cases. Not much. But she remained committed. She's an example to all. She was a woman of sacrifice. When she arrived at the house of God with her son Samuel, she said to Eli the priest in verse 26, because Eli didn't recognize her. She said, I am the woman that stood by thee here praying unto the Lord. I'm the one you accused of being drunk. For this child I prayed. So there she is with Samuel, 1 to 2 years old. For this child I prayed. And the Lord hath given me my petition, which I asked of him. For this child I prayed, and the Lord hath. For this child I prayed, and the Lord hath. And then in verse 28, therefore, because the Lord has given him to me, because of what God has done, I have lent him to the Lord. I give him back to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. Her heart is surrendered to God. She realizes that God has given to her so that she can give back to God. When you and I ask God to give us something, doesn't matter what it is. When we ask God to give us something, why do we do that? Why do we do that? Well, it's because I need that. Well, that's usually the case. But do we ever just ask God to give us something so we can give it back? That's Hannah. That's Hannah. She realizes that God is worthy of all. So she lets go. Oh, we all say, well, God's worthy of everything. Then why don't we give him everything? God's worthy of all. Is he worthy of your children? Is he worthy for you to just give your child to God? I've heard women for a long time now get very upset. Very upset. Something terribly wrong with that. Well, I don't want him to be a preacher. It's not up to you. And you shouldn't think it is. She surrendered. She surrendered him to God. She lets go. We also see that she was a woman of worship. She worshiped God when she came to the tabernacle to pour out her soul to God. She worshiped God when God Samuel. The whole time she was honoring her commitment. That was a way of worshiping God. And she was worshiping God when she came to give her son, to hand him over to the Lord. To grow up in the house of the Lord. To be raised basically by the priests. Chapter 2, we see that she's caught up with who God is. We're not going to take the time, but you read chapter 2 and you see that she's just rejoicing in God. She's now handed over Samuel, and she's just rejoicing in God. She said in verse 1, and Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoiceth in the Lord. My heart rejoiceth in the Lord." She said in the last part of that verse, "I rejoice in thy salvation. There's none as holy as the Lord. There is none beside thee. Neither is any rock like our God." She's looking back on her life, and she sees God in her life. And she's thanking Him for who He is. And she just goes on and on, talking about the Lord. She was a woman of worship, a woman of sacrifice. So there's Hannah, a woman who, in spite of trial, is a picture of God's grace. That's an example to all of us. She's a woman of prayer and faith. Again, an example to all of us. She's a woman who acknowledged God in her life. A woman of love and commitment to the Lord. Remain steadfast, regardless. A woman of sacrifice and worship. She's an example to all. Verse 21, and the Lord of chapter 2, and the Lord visited Hannah, so that she conceived and bare 3 sons and 2 daughters. She'd have 5 more children. While all that was going on, the child Samuel grew before the Lord. God blessed her. God blessed her abundantly. And I don't think Hannah ever looked back and said, "Oh, I wish I wouldn't have done that." That's not how commitment to God works. God blessed her, and I believe God gave her a peace that passeth understanding. Every time she would go up to the house of God, perhaps she saw Samuel. I imagine she did. But we thank God for women with the characteristics of Hannah, who are an example to all of us. And all of us ought to want to be an example. An example to all. Brother Ben, if you'd come and lead us in a verse of song, we'll